March 12, 1944, 6:47 a.m., outside Cassino, Italy. The Leary Valley lay thick in fog, the damp clinging to Dalton's uniform like cold velvet. Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton crouched in a muddy ditch, the rusted barbed wire looped around his entrenching tool, trembling in his gloved hands. Across the valley, the dull whine of a German SD KFZ-222 scout car sliced through the morning mist. The vehicle, four wheels spinning through mud, moved steadily toward the American lines at roughly 15 miles per hour. The hatch on top swung open. Dalton's breath hitched. No anti-tank weapons, no bazooka, no mines. Just a piece of wire, a pair of shovels, and the instinct of a man who had seen too many of his brothers die. Dalton grew up in the industrial sprawl of Gary, Indiana, the middle of 6 children. His father labored 15-hour shifts at U.S. Steel, tending molten iron, barely earning enough to feed and shelter the family. Jimmy learned to fix what others discarded: frayed cables, broken couplings, scraps of metal, all repurposed to prevent catastrophe. That mindset of improvisation would become his survival guide in Italy. By January 1943, 3 months after his 19th birthday, he enlisted. He traded the rails of Gary for the sands of North Africa and, eventually, the mountainous ridges of Italy, where the 34th Infantry Division advanced inch by inch against an entrenched German defense. The 34th had already lost dozens to reconnaissance vehicles alone. Private Eddie Kowalski, Sergeant Mike Brennan, Corporal Luis Vargas, all names Dalton remembered, all lost to a single, unstoppable type of enemy, the SD-KFZ-222. These light armored cars were fast, armored enough to shrug off rifle rounds, and armed with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34. Doctrine demanded anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or mines. The reality was grim. The division had 9 bazookas, no anti-tank rifles, and mines reserved for fortified positions. Soldiers died waiting for supplies that never came. Dalton had watched his friends fall. He was angry, yes, but angrier was his sense of preventable loss. Each death weighed on him, imprinting an urgency he couldn't ignore. That night, Dalton took his stand. Alone, he crept to the road used by the German scout cars. He carried 30 feet of rusted barbed wire, 2 folding shovels, and the determination of a man who had watched his squad decimated. The March mud sucked at his boots, artillery thundering in the distance like a storm that never ended. Trees framed the road, visibility perfect from the American positions, poor for approaching Germans. He drove one shovel into the earth on the left, angling it toward the line, hammered it deeper, then paced the road for the second shovel, 18 feet across. He wrapped the wire around both handles, stretched it taut at exactly axle height, and buried it under a thin layer of mud. 23 minutes of preparation, 30 feet of ingenuity. One corporal risking everything to do what doctrine forbade. The fog lingered. Dalton returned to his foxhole, M1 in hand, waiting. The scout car appeared at 6:43 a.m., engine whine rising through the gray mist. Dalton did not move. The hatch was open. The commander scanned. The gunner's 20mm cannon traversed lazily, bored. Then the vehicle approached the hidden wire. 15 miles per hour, 50 yards out. Dalton held his breath. 60 yards, 40, 30, 20, and then 6:47 a.m., March 12, 1944. The fog hung heavy over the Leary Valley, clinging to mud-slicked trees, muffling distant artillery. Dalton's heart pounded. The SD-KFZ-222, gray and silent, bore down on the trap he had set hours earlier. He could see the front wheels clearly now, mud-caked and spinning fast. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the vehicle would pass harmlessly, or worse, alert its comrades. Then it happened. The wire caught the right front wheel. Instant resistance. Dalton's mind raced. The momentum of the vehicle was too great for a simple stop. The car pivoted violently, nose dropping, rear rising. He could hear the groan of metal, smell the acrid scent of torn mud and grease. The vehicle rolled once, twice, 3 times, each rotation throwing the commander and gunner around like ragdolls. Dalton dropped his pack, sprinted toward the wreck, yelling for covering fire. Other soldiers poured from their foxholes, rifles ready, unsure what had just occurred. Smoke hissed from the engine compartment. The commander lay motionless. The gunner was trapped, unconscious, blood matted into his blonde hair. The driver crawled through the windshield, dazed, clutching his side. Dalton reached him first, pulled him clear, and handed him over to Private Morrison. His hands shook as adrenaline coursed through him. The wire had held. The shovels were bent and dragged, but intact. 30 feet of rusted ingenuity had just flipped a German armored car and potentially saved dozens of lives. Minutes later, Captain Morrison arrived, surveying the scene with practiced suspicion. "What happened?" he asked. Dalton shrugged, muttering about a pothole or debris. Morrison circled the wreck, searching for explosives, mines, or bazooka damage. There was none. The vehicle was simply overturned. Dalton said nothing. No one else had seen. Only he knew the truth. That afternoon, Dalton taught Morrison the setup again under the cover of darkness. 2 more shovels, 30 more feet of barbed wire, a different section of road. Placement, tension, concealment, all of it demonstrated by a 20-year-old corporal who had learned to fix problems with wire and scrap metal in the rail yards of Gary, Indiana. By March 15th, 6 soldiers knew the method, each keeping it quiet, passing it only to trusted comrades. Word spread like whispered rumors in the ranks. Private Jackson set a wire near San Pietro, Private Ali near the Garigliano River, Corporal Williams across a night patrol trail. None had permission. None documented it. But each encounter with a German scout car produced the same result. The second 222 flipped on March 18th, the third on March 21st. By March 25th, German reconnaissance activity in the sector had dropped by 60%. Patrols moved slower, commanders dismounted, inspecting the terrain. Dalton's improvised system had forced caution, disrupted operations, and most importantly, saved lives without a single friendly casualty. Dalton's ingenuity did not go unnoticed by the Germans. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division inspected the wreck of a 222 on March 27th. The front axle was bent but intact. No mine residue, no direct hits. Embedded in the wheel well was a fragment of rusted, barbed wire. Artor's intelligence report, filed March 29th, confirmed what Dalton had already accomplished. 3 unexplained losses, all caused by deliberate placement of wire. German units began scanning roads carefully, slowing their operations. American casualties plummeted. Artillery strikes, once frequent, dropped dramatically. Still, officially, no one knew. Dalton remained silent. His fellow soldiers protected the secret. Each successful deployment reinforced the reality that in war, rules and doctrine could not always save men. Sometimes improvisation, experience, and courage in the mud mattered more than manuals, orders, or badges. Dalton had invented a method that was simple, effective, and lethal to the enemy, but entirely invisible to the chain of command. By early April 1944, the wire flip had become a ghost tactic, unacknowledged, undocumented, yet undeniably effective. No officer had approved it, no manual had ever mentioned it, and no quartermaster would have supplied its bizarre components. But for the exhausted infantrymen of the 34th Division fighting through the brutal, mud-choked advance toward Monte Cassino, results mattered more than regulations. And Dalton's invention produced results no one could argue with. The men passed the method the way soldiers had passed survival tricks for centuries, quietly, directly, and only to those they trusted. Sergeant Will Donahue demonstrated it to his squad after losing 2 men to a German patrol the previous week. Private Lopez swore it could take down even heavier armored cars if the angle was right. Corporal Williams, whose calm demeanor masked nerves stretched thin by months of fighting, carried extra wire wrapped under his bedroll like contraband. Every night, under cover of darkness, new trip lines appeared in forgotten ditches, on narrow farm paths, or along washed-out mule tracks, anywhere a German scout car might prowl. The trick wasn't just the wire, it was the tension, the angle, the way the shovels bit into the mud, creating just enough resistance to catch a front tire and force a sudden pivot. It required finesse, a mechanic's instinct, and Dalton had a gift for teaching that instinct as naturally as he had learned it. Captain Morrison noticed the growing pattern. Fewer German vehicles spotted at dawn, fewer probing attacks, fewer hurried firefights that left young men bleeding in the fog. He didn't know the details. Every time he asked, soldiers answered vaguely. Rough terrain, lucky breaks. Maybe the road was soft, sir. But he wasn't a fool. He understood something was happening beneath the surface, something his men believed in, trusted, and refused to formally acknowledge because naming it might cause it to be banned. On April 9th, the mystery nearly unraveled. Lieutenant Howard, a rigid, by-the-book officer newly attached to the company, discovered Williams and Lopez crouched beside a ditch near a crossroads, wire in hand. "What in God's name are you two doing?" he barked. Lopez froze. Williams stammered. The operation was seconds from discovery when Morrison appeared, stepping between them with the calm authority of a man who'd seen enough war to know what mattered. "They're checking for mines, Lieutenant," he said firmly. "Last week the Krauts booby-trapped this road. I ordered them to look for residue." Howard frowned, unsure, scanning the mud. Then he nodded reluctantly and moved on. Only when he was gone did Morrison turn to the 2 men. His voice dropped low. "Finish fast, and don't get caught again. Understood?" They nodded. Morrison walked away, saying nothing more. But from that moment, the unspoken truth was clear. The captain knew, and he wasn't stopping it. The Germans adapted, but imperfectly. They began sending dismounted scouts ahead of the 222s, but those scouts were slow, vulnerable, and reluctant to wander too far in the darkness where American patrols prowled silently with bayonets fixed. Commanders ordered their vehicles to approach curves at a crawl, but that robbed them of momentum, and the sudden loss of speed made the crews anxious and jumpy. Dalton's makeshift device, born of rust, desperation, and a shovel handle, was now shaping enemy behavior across an entire sector. Still, Dalton himself remained curiously detached from the growing legend. He never boasted, never claimed credit. He maintained that he had simply got lucky once, and that others were the ones improving and using the technique. But his squad knew the truth. They had seen the moment when a corporal's scrap metal intuition had altered the battlefield. And the battlefield was about to change again. Because on April 14th, as the 34th prepared for a major push near the Rapido River, German armored reinforcements arrived, heavier vehicles, more cautious crews, and far more aggressive patrol patterns. The fragile balance that Dalton's tactic had created was about to be tested against machines far deadlier than the nimble SD-KFZ 222. April 14th, 1944. Pre-dawn mist settled like a blanket over the Rapido River Valley. Dalton sat in his foxhole, rifle across his knees, listening to the rhythmic hum of engines approaching from the north. This time, the Germans were not sending the light SD-KFZ 222s alone. He counted at least 4 heavier half-tracks moving cautiously along the muddy road. Each carried seasoned crews, trained to probe American positions and call in artillery with deadly precision. Dalton's improvised tripwire had always worked against the 222s, But these half-tracks were larger, sturdier, armored differently. He felt a familiar surge of tension, tempered by experience. The principle remained the same: locate predictable routes, exploit mechanical vulnerabilities, and apply minimal materials for maximum effect. He adjusted the tension on a new wire line, placed along a bend where the road narrowed between two oak trees. The shovels were dug deep, angled precisely, wire stretched taut at axle height. He had learned through trial and error over the past month that miscalculating height by even an inch could ruin the effect. The first vehicle approached silently. Dalton froze. The fog masked it, reducing visibility to barely 100 yards. He watched as the half-track's front axle hit the wire. A loud clang echoed, metal groaning as momentum collided with resistance. The vehicle veered violently, tires locked, and the driver fought for control. The rear swerved, scraping the road, throwing dirt and mud over the embankment. Dalton ducked instinctively, anticipating collapse. The half-track did not flip entirely as the 222s had, but it lurched off the road, sliding into a shallow ditch. Crew members scrambled, panicked, some wounded by thrown instruments or thrown off balance. Dalton moved in quickly, providing covering fire while his squad secured the captured personnel. The second vehicle approached, and the third. Each reacted similarly, slower, more cautious, as the crews realized the roads were no longer predictable. Dalton observed the chaos with grim satisfaction. Artillery calls were reduced dramatically. The Germans were hesitating. Reconnaissance was disrupted not by numbers, not by advanced weaponry, but by a simple wire, a pair of shovels, and the intuition of a young corporal who refused to watch his men die needlessly. By the evening, the entire company sector was quieter. German patrols had become hyper-vigilant, stopping every 50 yards to inspect the road for traps. The constant tempo of their operations had slowed by nearly half. Dalton and Morrison surveyed the results from a ridge. "They've learned caution," Morrison said quietly, eyes scanning the horizon. Dalton nodded, knowing full well the Germans didn't understand why. They didn't know the wire existed, only that something was forcing them to adapt. Over the next week, more soldiers learned the placement technique under Dalton's guidance. Word spread quietly, carefully. Morrison documented the methods in a private notebook, sketching angles, spacing, tension, and concealment techniques. By April 21st, a dozen soldiers across the company sector were deploying tripwires nightly, each line carefully positioned and removed if enemy patrols approached during daylight. Dalton had created an underground network of improvised anti-vehicle tactics, entirely invisible to official channels, but decisively influencing the battlefield. Even the engineers sent from division headquarters could not account for the sudden reduction in casualties and reconnaissance activity. Reports came back. Patrols fewer, artillery strikes lower, German confidence shaken. Dalton had created a paradoxical reality. He had broken enemy effectiveness without breaking a single regulation they would officially recognize. And yet, Dalton remained humble. He never claimed ownership. He taught, corrected mistakes, and moved quietly through the mud, observing, adjusting. Each success was measured in saved lives, not medals. He knew better than anyone that the simplest solution often came from those closest to the problem. A young corporal, muddy boots, and the ingenuity forged on the rails of Gary, Indiana. By late April 1944, the 34th Infantry Division's improved performance against reconnaissance vehicles had drawn attention from higher command. Casualty reports, artillery logs, and patrol records told an unusual story. German reconnaissance activity was down, and artillery strikes were less frequent. Colonel Anderson, the division's intelligence officer, studied the data with a skeptical eye. The patterns were too consistent to be random. Anderson sent investigators to the front lines to identify the cause. Within 2 days, they found the tripwires. Carefully strung, barbed wire at axle height, supported by rusted shovels. The investigators were baffled. Official manuals did not sanction such tactics. Engineering regulations required specialized obstacles for vehicle interdiction, not improvised wire traps. Yet the evidence was clear. Vehicles were being disabled consistently, crews captured or injured, and the enemy was hesitating to probe American positions. Morrison met with the investigators quietly, showing them nothing more than the roads and terrain. He documented the layout, timing, and placement of wires, but avoided revealing Dalton's identity or method. The investigators reported back, formally recommending discontinuation. Their conclusion: unauthorized, unsafe, and outside doctrine. The order came down to the company: discontinue immediately. Morrison read the order, then set it aside. He knew the troops depended on the wires for survival. Ceasing their use would likely cost more lives than the method risked. Instead, he silently allowed Dalton and the trained soldiers to continue deploying wires while documenting their results under controlled observation for statistical validation. By early May, the casualty rate from reconnaissance attacks had dropped dramatically. In February 1944, before Dalton's tripwires, the company had lost 47 men to German scouts in just 6 weeks. By March, after the wires were in place, casualties fell to 12, and in April, only 3 soldiers were lost to similar attacks. Reconnaissance sightings in the sector declined sharply, and artillery calls, triggered by enemy observation, dropped by nearly 70%. Dalton's contribution remained invisible in official reports. Colonel Anderson, pragmatic and aware of the ethical dilemma, chose not to endorse the method formally. He could not approve an approach outside doctrine, yet the results spoke for themselves. The division's operations benefited enormously from Dalton's improvisation, yet the method remained an unacknowledged secret, passed quietly from soldier to soldier, preserved by those who had seen its effectiveness firsthand. Dalton, Morrison, and a small cadre of trusted soldiers continued refining placement techniques, tension calibration, and concealment strategies. By May 1944, the tripwire method had spread informally to 3 divisions along the Italian front. Soldiers whispered about its effectiveness, but never reported it up the chain. It was a shadow innovation, quietly reshaping the battlefield without ever appearing in manuals or gaining medals. And through it all, Dalton stayed in the background. He trained others, corrected errors, and ensured every deployment was executed safely. The fog of war concealed his contribution, but every flipped vehicle, every captured crew, and every saved life carried the silent proof of his ingenuity. May 23, 1944. Dalton reported to division headquarters near Naples, a fresh uniform on his back and a rifle stowed in the corner of the tent office. Colonel Anderson, calm and deliberate, looked up from his papers. "Corporal Dalton," he said, "I've read the reports on your wire method." Dalton stiffened. Reports? He had left the wires unrecorded, undocumented, an invisible tool in the fog of war. "I'm not here to punish you," Anderson continued. "I'm here to ask you to teach it. The 36th Infantry Division is taking over your sector. They need to understand reconnaissance interdiction. Your method, improvised obstacle imp placement, is effective, simple, and saves lives." Dalton blinked, absorbing the weight of the moment. Officially, he would train others without recognition, without approval, yet the Army was giving him a quiet mandate to continue. It was paradoxical, surreal, and profoundly meaningful. Over the next 2 weeks in June, Dalton instructed 60 soldiers on the technique: placement, tension, concealment, removal. He emphasized precision, teaching them how a single inch in height or a slight slack in tension could nullify the effect. Soldiers were skeptical at first. Wire could not possibly stop armor, they thought. But Dalton demonstrated photographs of flipped scout cars, shared casualty statistics, and guided hands-on practice. By July, the method had quietly spread to 3 divisions. By August, it was in use across the Italian front. No official acknowledgement existed, no medals, no citations, no documentation. The knowledge passed in whispers through late-night conversations between soldiers who understood its value. Yet its impact was undeniable. Conservative estimates credited Dalton's method with disabling or destroying 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. The lives saved were staggering. Hundreds of artillery strikes were prevented, easily protecting 300 to 400 men who would have otherwise been casualties. Division staff attributed the reduction to better defensive discipline, improved anti-tank capabilities, and fortuitous terrain, but no one documented Dalton's name. The innovation remained hidden, effective only because those who knew the secret valued results over recognition. Dalton himself remained humble. He returned to the field, continuing to oversee installations quietly, correcting errors, and ensuring that each wire was deployed safely. Every success reinforced his belief. Innovation in war does not emerge from committees or manuals. It comes from soldiers in the mud, responding to necessity with ingenuity, courage, and a refusal to accept needless deaths. November 1945. James Dalton, now a sergeant, returned to Gary, Indiana, stepping off the train into a world that had moved on while he fought to hold others alive. The 34th Infantry Division had been pulled from the front. Men rested, refitted, and scattered to civilian life. Dalton's war was over, yet the echoes of the Rapido Valley, the fog, the scout cars, and the wire traps lingered in his mind. He went back to U.S. Steel, to the same rail yards where he had learned to improvise, to see how minor adjustments could prevent catastrophic failures. The principles that had saved lives in Italy, the careful assessment of risk, the recognition of mechanical weaknesses, and the creative use of limited resources were exactly the skills that had kept him alive. Dalton married Dorothy from East Chicago, raised 3 children, and never spoke in detail of Italy. When friends asked, he would only say, "I did my job and came home." Yet the method he invented did not disappear. Post-war, military engineers studying the Italian campaign noticed a pattern. Repeated disabling of reconnaissance vehicles in early 1944 that could not be explained by conventional tactics. Interviews with veterans eventually led to Dalton. He gave one interview explaining the method, the placements, and the rationale, but requested anonymity. His story was published in 1965 in the Journal of Military History, credited only to unidentified NCOs of the 34th Infantry Division. Dalton's role remained invisible, as he had wished. The impact of his innovation endured far beyond the battlefield. By 1949, axle height wire obstacles were formally integrated into U.S. Army doctrine as an approved method for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. Variations of the technique entered training manuals, taught to soldiers in anti-armor and reconnaissance courses. The principle persisted into modern military engineering, influencing vehicle obstacle planning and even some counter-IED strategies. Dalton's work had transcended recognition, becoming a standard tool for saving lives. James Dalton passed away in 1987 at age 63, heart attack in his living room. His obituary noted only that he had served in World War II and worked 41 years for U.S. Steel. The tripwires, the flipped scout cars, and the hundreds of lives saved remained a secret only his fellow soldiers truly knew. Yet the method continued to be taught, deployed, and adapted. Sometimes, Dalton would receive phone calls on March 12th, calls from Morrison, Williams, or Jackson. Short conversations, a shared memory of foggy mornings, the whine of German engines, and the simple, lethal ingenuity of a piece of wire stretched across a road. It was enough. The man who had solved a problem that stumped entire engineering corps had no medals, no fame, no official acknowledgement. But through his quiet courage, through the work of a corporal unwilling to watch his friends die, the lives of hundreds were spared. And the principle that simple, soldier-led innovation can change the course of events, remained eternal. The tripwire is still taught. The method endures. The man who invented it returned to the rails and never told anyone, knowing that sometimes the most profound legacies are the ones left unspoken.